Return to this subject from last week in a future week because I want to kind of revisit it when they're back and use today as a kind of separate independent topic. Does that sound okay?
I was going to say if they're not here, maybe you should review for those
yes,
who are
but
here.
the problem is I will do that, but for today I want to first explore this, the reading material.
This is it's funny because Nathan Englander grew up in my state over West Hempstead.
Yes.
I know him from when he was a tiny little
so
boy.
far.
Yeah, come on.
I don't have to turn my neck sideways.
This
Oh,
is
yeah.
very
I can look straight.
Okay, so what I want to do today is actually tackle together with you a separate subject. Last week we did an introduction to AVEILUT. I did a taxonomy of the different approaches to AVEILUT and specifically highlighted that the Jewish perspective on AVEILUT underscores the important role that the community plays in bringing the Avel back from the natural state of kind of social isolation that unfolds in the aftermath of the loss of a loved one. So we talked about that. We left off before we got to the Rambam and the Rambam's take on it. We'll pick up with that, God willing, next week. What I wanted to do today is explore an independent topic, one which occupies a lot of my time as a shul rabbi, and one which I think the books that are all very helpful on the laws of AVEILUT don't fully capture. And that is that there is a general principle when it comes to AVEILUT, which comes up in many places in the Gemara and then later on in the Poskim, halacha kedivrei hamekel ba'avel. The law follows the lenient view when it comes to the laws of AVEILUT. Okay, that's a halachic principle which is ubiquitous in sources relating to AVEILUT, but defining precisely what that principle means is somewhat elusive. And so what I want to try to do this morning is study this principle as it's expressed specifically in one passage in the Gemara, the first place that it appears in the Gemara, and hopefully through studying that passage we'll be able to get a better understanding of what that principle actually means and how it should inform the way we think about AVEILUT and the way that the halacha guides us through the mourning cycle as a whole. Yes?
For those who, sorry I wasn't here, are you defining AVEILUT as after the burial?
So for the time being, we're not necessarily being specific, but I would say that this course, these classes are looking at the entirety from including burial and pre-burial practices. We touched on them briefly last week on how Aninut really reflects that profound sense of social isolation and not even performing the mitzvot is a way of kind of saying that I can't just carry on with business as usual. So the AVEILUT that we're talking about here is not the precise halachic term, which you're correct. It's really only after burial. It's more of a catch-all for mourning practices. And in the last week of the class, we're actually going to explore a phenomenon which I think is really significant and interesting, which is that some of the cases of mourning in Tanakh actually precede the death, even. Forget before the burial. So we'll talk a little bit about that, like David mourning for the child when the child is sick before the child actually dies. So that's something that I call anticipatory AVEILUT, which is also an important element that's underexplored. So again, the goal of these classes is to kind of take these familiar ideas and push ourselves to examine them afresh with a different lens and a different perspective, and maybe gain some richer understanding of what the halacha and what Jewish texts are kind of pushing us when it comes to these practices.
And some of them are more makale than others.
Right. So that's what we're really going to look at today, and this is really a byproduct of being a congregational rabbi. This is not a sheer or a perspective, a mahalach, if you will, that can emerge from just studying the texts in yeshiva. It's really when you talk about living these practices and how to apply them to individual circumstances, that the whole perspective on halacha kedivrei hamekel ba'avel emerged. So let's begin by framing the question, okay? What's the reason for this general principle when it comes to the laws of mourning? Why do we follow the lenient view? Okay. Well,
I'm sorry, is that generally accepted?
that is a principle that appears in many places in the Gemara and is adopted by the poskim, not necessarily across the board. We'll get a little bit later on to places where we don't apply that principle. And I'm sorry for the Hebrew. I'll translate everything, but I didn't have enough time to get all of the English sources. But it's all in a Google Doc, so I hope to kind of keep on updating it. So the Ramban poses this question. Nachmanides Ramban has a critical work on the laws of mourning called Torat Ha'adam, and that work ends up being one of the primary texts for the Tur, the Beit Yosef, and the Shulchan Aruch, where we get the laws of AVEILUT from. It's not the Ramban's commentary on the Torah. It's a separate work called or on the Gemara. It's a separate work called Torat Ha'adam, and it contains it's so rich and so significant, and it's arranged topically as opposed to Al Seder Hadaf of the Gemara, so that makes it a little bit easier to learn. It makes it a little harder if you're learning the Gemara to kind of find exactly where it is. So the Ramban poses this question. I've given you the page number in the Mosad Rav Kook Kitvei HaRamban edition. So that's Amud Reish Yud Aleph, page 211. So I just want to kind of frame our discussion with the Ramban's question about what does this mean? Umasha pasku halacha kedivrei hamekel ba'avel yesh lomar mipnei shelo matzao machloket sheba'avel elu b'shel divreihem. So the first thing he says is, you know why we say halacha kedivrei hamekel ba'avel? Because these are all rabbinic practices, and halacha kedivrei hamekel ba'avel is really just a subset of the general psak of Safek Dirabanan Lekula. Right? There's a general klalei hapsak, there are general rules of how we paskin questions when we're in doubt or where there's a debate. And we normally say if we have a doubt about a biblical law, we are machmir, and if we have a doubt about a rabbinic law, we're mekel. So the Ramban initially begins his treatment of this principle by saying, you know why we're lenient when it comes to the psak of mourning? It's because the laws of mourning are, he's going to admit a little later on in a minute, 99.9% rabbinic, right? The actual laws of AVEILUT themselves, perhaps the day of death, if the burial and the date of death coincide, there may be a biblical status to that first day of mourning, but certainly Shiva, and even if the first day of mourning, if it's not this date of the actual death, is not biblical in nature. So the Ramban starts off by saying, you know why we say halacha kedivrei hamekel ba'avel? Because this is all rabbinic law anyway. So we can be lenient. It's just an application of another general rule, which is that we go with the lenient opinion.
Just the rabbis.
Right. Kagon b'miktsas shvi'i kukulo, ubenetilat tzipernayim, ubebami makom rachok mishlosha ve'elach imoni mahen ubeshmur rachoka. So he then references the places in the Gemara where this comes up. We're gonna look at them. Right? One of the areas where we see this, we don't necessarily register as this. Right? The last day of Shiva is always just a partial day. Right? You sit usually in the morning just for a few minutes after davening or whatever it is, and then you get up. Why is that? Because there's this rule, miktsat hayom kakulo, that part of the day is considered like the whole day. What's that about? Well, there's a whole debate about how you count the days of Shiva. Do you have to have 7 24-hour periods, or can you count part of the first day, part of the last day? And we paskin miktsat hayom kakulo because halacha k'divrei mekel ba'avel, because we're dealing with rabbinic issues, the Ramban says. And so that's why we can go with the lenient view. And similarly, when it comes to cutting one's nails, and another issue which comes up a lot nowadays when some people fly to Israel for a burial and some people remain behind, how you calculate the mourning period. Do they sit together? My general rule is families should try to complete their Shiva at the same time, if at all possible. Some people don't agree with me on that, but we'll talk about it. Again, every scenario is slightly different, and that's why there's not a one-size-fits-all psak. Okay. Skipping to the second paragraph. The Ramban then says, well, maybe not. The scholars from France, the Tosafis, Amru b'toso de'efsher shapasku kishapasku alach k'divrei mekel ba'avel lo mipnei shehu shel divreim ela afilu b'shel Torah va'afilu b'rishon pasku kach. Then the Ramban says, you know what? There's this other tradition that halacha k'divrei mekel ba'avel, that this tendency toward leniency in the laws of mourning is not based on rabbinic law and other klalei hapsak, other general rules of halachic practice. It's something special, it's something unique, it's something distinct to the laws of mourning. Okay. The Ramban says he's not sure exactly how to navigate this. Shilu mitam kula shel divreim yachid b'makom rabim halacha kirabim. Because if it was just based on this klalei hapsak, the general principles of how you follow the lenient view when it comes to rabbinic law, well, there's another klalei hapsak, which is that if you have a minority opinion and a majority view, you follow the majority view when it comes to rabbinic law as well. So if all we were doing was applying the general rule of Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula, well, that would conflict with Yachid V'Rabim, Halachic Harabim. Then we have these two different Klalei Psak, and Yachid V'Rabim, Halachic Harabim should win out over that, and we find that it doesn't win out over that in AVEILUT. So this is why the Tosafists say there's something else going on here. It's not just the application of the general rules. Ela kulahu afal pishu b'shal Torah v'chein he mefarshim halachic divrei mekel be'eruv afilu min haTorah. Okay. And the Ramban says, I don't get it. Lama yehei halacha kedivrei hamekel ba'avel b'shal Torah. I don't understand why this would be. Then he throws in a line, 3 lines from the bottom that I want us to focus on for just a moment, right after the period in the middle of the line. V'shema mipnei she'ein da'ato shel adam onenet misafek v'libo nimshach achar hasimcha. He says, well, maybe the reason why we're lenient when it comes to the laws of AVEILUT is because a person, when they're in doubt,
Wants to be happy.
won't gravitate towards a feeling of grief, but instead they'll slide to more of a joyous outlook. Okay, it's an interesting proposition. he's grasping here at straws a little bit. And what I want to try to do is actually go back to the original source in the Talmud where we find this principle first invoked, and maybe revisit why it would be a specific principle that guides how we paskin when it comes to the laws of AVEILUT. I think the Ramban here is grappling with something. He dismisses this view. He thinks it's just a general klalei psak, but I actually think his intuition, or what he says the Chachmei Tzarfatim seem to express, has a great deal of validity. We just need to fine-tune, or try to fine-tune, exactly what it is about AVEILUT that makes halacha kedivrei hamekel specific to it. Okay? All right, so what we've seen so far is just a comment of the Ramban trying to determine why there is this general rule about following the lenient view. He proposes and accepts the view that this is just a kind of general how we interpret, how we generally paskin these issues. It's d'Rabbanan, whatever it is. He points out that the Tosfot seem to have a different perspective, and he can't fully explain what that perspective is. He says maybe it's because people don't have the capacity to really grieve or express their grief when it's not clear if this should be an expression of grief. That's sort of what he's saying. I'm not sure if that bears itself out. Any questions? Okay, so let's look at the next source. We may not get beyond this source because this is, I think, the basis for everything we're going to see when it comes to this idea. Okay, and this, again, I referenced last week how when my wife was in her year of AVEILUT, it also really highlighted how the case-by-case nature of the laws of mourning, how important it is to kind of have a relationship with a halachic advisor, so that they can kind of help you navigate some of these really interesting issues. So the first place, again, the original source for halacha kedivrei hamekel ba'avel is in the context of cutting one's fingernails during the week of Shiva. That's where it is. So let's take a look at the Gemara in the Bavli. This is a remarkable passage, a tragic one, like many of the Gemaras about mourning. And it begins with a halachic discussion with legal rulings, and then it moves to Agadah. It moves on to a story, and we're going to have to get into the relationship between the halacha and Agadah. Tana Rabbanan. So this is the source that's marked 1 on the page under Bet Sugyot HaMishtabshot B'Klal, the passages in the Gemara that use this principle. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Kishem she'amru asur legaleach b'moed, kach asur litotzi parnaim b'moed. Just like you're not supposed to shave during Chol HaMoed, so too you're not supposed to cut one's nails during Chol HaMoed. Again, when it comes to Chol HaMoed, the concern was that if you permit it during Chol HaMoed, people will then not do what they have to do in advance of the holiday, before the holiday, and they'll say, oh, I can get a haircut, I can shave, I can cut my nails during Chol HaMoed. And so as to kind of make sure you don't do that, there were built-in measures to prevent that. Okay. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi Matir. Next line's important. Ukeshem she'amru avel asur legaleach b'mei avlo. And just like we said that a mourner is not supposed to shave during the mourning period, let's assume for now that that's the Shiva. We'll talk later. Shiva Shloshim. Kach asur litotzi parnai b'mei avlo. So too, you're not supposed to cut one's nails during the period of mourning. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. For Rabbi Yossi Matir. But Rabbi Yossi says, no, a mourner is allowed to cut their nails. So how do we paskin? Right? Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi are Tanaim who have this debate. Ula, the Amora, comes along and says, Amar Ula halacha k'Rabbi Yehuda ba'avel, v'halacha k'Rabbi Yossi b'moed. Ula says we rule like Rabbi Yehuda. We're stringent when it comes to AVEILUT. You can't cut your nails just like you can't shave. But when it comes to Chol HaMoed, we paskin like Rabbi Yossi and we're lenient.
Who's Ula?
Ula is an Amora who lived, he's
No, it's interesting because it's someone that we actually, a name that I personally am not familiar with, and he's the one who's the decisor of these two.
He's one of the two. We're going to see. Shmuel Amar. Shmuel says, Shmuel's a more well-known, a second generation Amora from Bavel. Amar halacha k'Rabbi Yossi b'moed u'ba'ava. We paskin like Rabbi Yossi and we're lenient, not just when it comes to Chol HaMoed, but also when it comes to AVEILUT. Da'amar Shmuel, because Shmuel says, halacha k'divrei hamekil ba'ava. This is the first passage in the Gemara where we have this phrase appear. Shmuel, the Gemara quotes Shmuel to justify Shmuel's psak here, meaning it says this is part of a larger perspective that Shmuel articulates, which is, if there's a debate, Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda have this debate, can I cut my nails during Shiva? Rabbi Yehuda says no, Rabbi Yossi says yes. Shmuel says, of course you're allowed to. Halacha k'divrei hamekil
So where does
ba'ava.
Shmuel get this from?
Okay, so what we have is that Shmuel says this principle. We don't have why he says this principle, but if you read this Gemara, it doesn't sound like the Ramban's explanation of this is part of a general kind of lenient psak because it's rabbinic law. We identify halacha k'divrei hamekil ba'ava. Okay, now it could be that Shmuel's perspective is, listen, it's hard enough to grieve. It's painful. We don't need to pile on. So if there's a view that we can go with that supports a more lenient understanding, we should follow that. But the Gemara will immediately complicate this and problematize it with the story that follows. Okay, are we ready? This story is heavy, but I think it's really instructive, and I think it forces us to confront exactly the question that was asked. Where does Shmuel get this from? What's he trying to say? And what does it mean for us when we think about our morning practices?
Can I just mention
Please.
something?
Yeah.
The second shita actually resonates because for Moed, you know it's coming. So in terms of hachana, you can prepare yourself.
Right.
You don't have. You can do your nails a week before.
Right.
You can shave a week before.
Right.
You can cut your hair a week before. With AVEILUT, you don't have that breva.
It's an excellent point because the whole reason why this comes up, the laws of AVEILUT comes up where it does, is in the context of what are you allowed to do in Chol HaMoed, what are you not allowed to do in Chol HaMoed, based on what was beyond your control. If you were away, out at sea and couldn't prepare for the Moed, there are allowances on Chol HaMoed to go ahead and do it. So you're right, based on the general rule when it comes to Moed and the idea of being, you have the time to prepare, do it, and if you didn't have the time to prepare, there are allowances for it. AVEILUT perhaps should follow that rule.
So
Good.
I had the question whether I could cut my hair on Erev Pesach because the Shloshim ends with Pesach.
The onset of Pesach.
With the onset of Pesach.
Right.
So one person told me you can't, and then one person said that for Pesach there's a special
Right.
allowance.
Right.
And I didn't know, is that because we're going to Sphira?
No. For Pesach, there's a mini holiday on the afternoon of the 14th. If you look at the Torah,
Right,
there's
so they
Chag
said I could do it in the
HaPesach.
afternoon, but then they said I could do it in the morning if I needed to.
Okay.
So I don't know, I'm not going to tell you
Okay.
who said it to me.
It's all
but
good.
whatever.
Again, I think every circumstance is
Yeah.
different. I'm not going to cast any aspersions.
But it is really for the afternoon.
It's
That's
that the afternoon is when that, but it may be that in advance of that there are allowances. I'm not
Okay.
in the middle of that,
Yeah.
so you're right now.
I know,
Yeah.
I'm not asking for you, I'm just explaining what
Yeah.
happened to me, what my.
Okay, so now we have a story of involving Shmuel. I don't know how many times the Gemara has a legal discussion, and then the protagonists of the story that immediately follow are the people who had the legal discussion just beforehand. There's one case where the Gemara about Purim, where you have the line in the Gemara where Rabbi says that a person's supposed to get drunk on Purim Chayav Inish Lebesume B'Puraya Ad Lo Yada Ben Aroham Baruch Mordechai, and then the very next line in the Gemara is that he went. Now there's a Girsa question whether it's Rava or Rabba, but Rava and Reb Zera had their Suda together, and Reb Zera Shachte le Rava, Reb Zera killed him. So that's a good example of where the Gemara is possibly using the story to undermine the legal ruling, or at least to expose, in the context of Purim, how absurd it is to legislate how much you drink, right? There's a kind of absurdity in legislating the unlegislatable. And I think there's not something very different going on here. There's something kind of similar here, and that is the challenge of legislating in this emotional realm. So let's take a look at the story. And the story here forces us to reassess what exactly Halach Divrei Megil means, or what it should mean. Shmuel might have meant it one way. We're going to see how Shmuel conceived of this idea. But the Gemara here, by posing this story, by editing this story right after Shmuel issues the ruling, seems to have other ideas. So let's take a look. Pinchas Achva Demar Shmuel. Pinchas was the brother of Shmuel. Itra Bei Milta. Okay, this is an interesting term. A matter happened to him. This is the Gemara's euphemism for he suffered a loss. Right? It doesn't say somebody died. The Gemara uses kind of careful euphemistic language. Itra Bei Milta. A matter occurred with him. Now, if Pinchas is sitting Shiva and Shmuel is not sitting Shiva, and they're brothers, then presumably it's Pinchas's spouse or child, right? The Gemara doesn't delineate exactly who he's sitting Shiva for, but putting two and two together, that's what's going on.
Right, it's not a parent.
Right. Or a sibling. Because
Right.
if it was one of their siblings, they'd be sitting Shiva together.
Right.
Al Shmuel Lemishal Tama Mineh. Shmuel went up. Shmuel went on a Shiva visit. But here the Gemara also uses really interesting language. Lemishal Tama Mineh. To inquire the reasoning with him. I'm not sure exactly why the Gemara expresses it like that. But Shmuel,
Same with Hain.
right? Shmuel went to inquire with him, maybe to see how he was doing. Mishal Tama, it's not like just Shayla. It wasn't to find out about his well-being. It's not exactly clear.
And he knew why he was, it's not like he didn't know why he was sitting Shiva.
Right. He presume he knew. Is there a blame thing going on here? That's
Or he was
beneath the
unaware
surface.
of,
Yeah, it's not clear. It seems like he knew, and he's trying to figure out why this happened. I don't know.
Is the phrase Itra Milta commonly used for
Yes,
loss?
this isn't the only place that it's used, but for Nichum Avelim, I'm not sure if there's any other Gemara which has this Lemishal Tam. I mean, I have to double check. Itra Bei Milta is a pretty common. There aren't so many stories in the Gemara about people dying. There are more than you think, but
Could it refer to?
he's unaware of something.
right.
Or is it possible they were not living in close proximity, and he was interested in what actually occurred that
Yeah.
led up to the death?
Yeah, it could be. Sometimes that becomes a preoccupation at Shiva. People start talking about the last week, what happened, that's always, could be. Chazanu litofre dehavu nefisha. So Shmuel comes to pay a Shiva visit, and he sees that Pinchas's fingernails are overgrown. Nefishin is that they're expanded, they're large, right? The tufre, he sees the fingernails, and he sees that they're just completely unkempt. Amar le. So Shmuel says to his brother, Amai lo shakalt lahu. Why haven't you cut your nails? I would imagine that Shmuel's the older brother, but I don't know that for sure. We don't know the family dynamic for sure.
He's critical.
He's critical of his brother who's sitting Shiva. Right?
He caught him.
He says, what do you... I imagine, based on the previous line of Gemara, don't you know, I paskin, you can cut your nails during Shiva. Halacha k'divrei hamekel ba'avel. Cut your nails. You don't have to, scare off all the visitors with your,
Fangs.
Exactly. Amai lo shakalt lahu. So Pinchas responds, Amar le, ibididei hava, mi mizalzalev be kulehai. If it was you, if I was coming to, would you want, if you had a loss, would you want me criticizing you about how you're keeping your nails?
It's not nice.
Right. Okay. The Gemara goes on and it gets more tragic. Havai kishgaga sheyotze milifnei hashalit. The verse in Kohelet. It was like an unintentional act which came out. The words came tumbling out of his mouth. What did Pinchas basically say to Shmuel? Like, when you're sitting Shiva, you can decide what you want to do with your nails. Like, leave me alone. I'm sitting Shiva here. I want to let my nails grow. Let my nails grow. Right? But as the words tumble out, the Gemara makes it sound like that causes all kinds of repercussions. The itra be milta b'Shmuel. And now, something happens to Shmuel. Now Shmuel is sitting Shiva. Al Pinchas, achva lemishel tama mineh. And Pinchas now goes to pay a Shiva visit to his brother Shmuel. Shaklinu letufrei, chabtinu la'apeh. Shmuel takes the cut fingernails and he throws them at his brother Pinchas. Amar le, and he says to him, Let lach brit kruta lisvatayim. Don't you believe in the principle that the covenants can be sealed with the lips? Meaning, your words, you generated this. Shmuel is saying to Pinchas, you somehow caused this when you said to me,
Why don't you cut your finger?
Yeah, we know it's actually Shmuel is mad at Pinchas that he responded to his comment about cutting his fingernails by saying, when you're sitting Shiva, you'll cut your own finger, you'll decide what you want to do. Shmuel now kind of throws the fingernails at him. Da'amar Rabbi Yochanan minayin shebrit kruta lisvatayim shenemar vayomer Avraham el na'arav shulachem poim achamor v'hani v'hanar nelcha adko v'nishtachava v'nashuva aleichem v'istaya milta. There is this notion in rabbinic, and again, this Gemara, one of the goals of this Gemara has nothing to do with AVEILUT. It has to do with the idea of language and being careful with our language, and specifically maybe in a house of mourning, being careful with our language. And the idea here is we have this proof that when Avram said to his servants right before the binding of Isaac, I'll be back with him in a couple of days, and we'll come back to you. And lo and behold, that's what ended up happening. That sometimes there's a power of speech. The power of what we say can result in what we say coming true. So just like in Avram's case, that was a positive conclusion that he said, we'll come back in a couple of days. At the time, Avram couldn't have thought that they would return because he had been told to sacrifice his son. But since Avram said it like that, it ended up happening. And so there's this general idea of we got to be careful with our words. So I think on one level, the goal of this passage is to kind of convey that message. And I think that's why it talks about death in that euphemistic way. Itra be'milta. Even the language with which we use to talk about death is veiled, is obscured, is
Subtle.
what?
Subtle.
Yes, correct. It's not
You say passes away.
right, correct. So the language, the Gemara here is making a point about language. But I want to dive back in. The Gemara, I think, is also conveying an important point about this idea of halacha k'divrei mekel ba'avel. Right? Shmuel says to his brother, why aren't you cutting your nails? He doesn't explicitly say, I pass him that it's okay. He says, but there's a lenient view when it comes to mourning that you're allowed to cut your nails, so why don't you cut your nails? So what's the response of Pinchas? Leaving aside about whether that caused whatever happened to Shmuel, which is a terrible thing, but what's Pinchas's response, and what does it force us to how do we reconsider this principle of halacha k'divrei hamekel? How do you read this exchange? How do you understand this exchange?
I'm not sure if I'm responding to your question.
Yeah.
But I think it's an issue of when something is declared makil by a posek, does that mean that you have to follow that? Or can your own emotional response to your AVEILUT determine your own comfort level with doing things that may not fall into the makil category?
Excellent. Okay. I want to unpack that in a moment because I think that's really, we need to define lenient.
I was going to
Yeah.
say, makel sometimes means the opposite of what you think it means.
Right.
And the question is,
Good.
perhaps allowing him to keep his nails long
Right.
is makel.
Good. Good. Sure.
I see it as a whole different issue, and there are plays written about it, is that death in the family precipitates the rise of unresolved problems. Unresolved.
I think
Yeah,
that
too.
that's a phenomenal reading of this
Yes.
story. Pinchas and Shmuel,
Right.
they need family
Yeah.
therapy.
It's more than fingernails.
Correct. That's it. That's a good way to describe that Gemara.
Right.
Pinchas and Shmuel, the brothers, it's much more than fingernails.
Right.
Good. So I think that's certainly true, but I think you both hit upon kind of the crux of this matter and why this principle is so apt for AVEILUT, but also so easily misapplied and misunderstood. And Shmuel seems to be the one who even though he articulates the principle, doesn't fully get it, right? Shmuel had said, you're allowed to cut your nails, you're an Avel, maybe what you were saying before, you didn't anticipate this happening, so of course we should be lenient. In the parallel case of the Moed, we have the similar kind of circumstance and say that if it was out of your control, go ahead, you can go ahead and do it. This is like one of the questions I get, like the buying clothes thing during the year, and then you have people who, in anticipation of the parent passing away, start buying clothes the week, when they're in hospice. And I'm sometimes like, spend time with your parent these few days, and we'll worry about the clothing piece of it at a later date. And part of it is, again, if you view things through this binary of machmir and makil, you can fall into that trap of
Missing the point.
what?
Missing the point.
Correct, exactly. And I think Shmuel here misses the point of his own principle. Shmuel had said, halach k'divrei mekel ba'avel, so you can go ahead and cut your fingernails. But his brother says, I don't want to. For me, the way in which I feel like I want to express my mourning is not worrying about what the visitors who come to see me think of my hygiene and the like. What I want to do is be in it and inhabit that mourning. whether it's a spouse or my read is that it's a child, because Itra Beimilta is, again, like a very euphemistic language when it comes to a death, and I feel like it's the ineffable and the unutterable. Jewish law and societies have lots of words for orphans. We don't have language or a term for when you lose a child, because it's almost hard to utter. And so I think Pinchas is saying to Shmuel, like, this is not comforting. This is not leniency. This is not your AVEILUT to kind of project onto me. And so that, I think, is the start. Literally, it's the original sugya of halachic divrei hamekel ba'avel, and I think that needs to inform how we think about it. And what that means is, we don't just say, okay, what's the stringent view and what's the lenient view, and go from there. We need to kind of evaluate the individual mourner, the circumstances, and the like. So let me give you just a few examples of even where the Gemara applies these rules, and how you could easily misapply it. I've been at circumstances where a close friend or even a family member was out of town for Shiva, and they're arriving back the morning of the conclusion of Shiva. Okay? So the halacha is miktzah sayom kukulo, part of the day counts, and as soon as you sit for a couple minutes and someone says hamakom, everybody gets up, and then the Shiva's over. So of course, if this person wants, for their own kind of well-being and mourning and grieving process, to have this close friend or relative spend a few moments with them when they're in that particular state, then that's okay. That's the lenient ruling. That's the Makil ruling in that particular scenario. Another circumstance where this, I think, very often comes up is when it comes to families who split at some point for the Shiva. One of the things that I think the families should figure out in consultation with the rabbi is kind of what would be most meaningful to everyone involved. For some families, it will be, we want to finish our Shiva together, and there's plenty of halachic room to say that those who started a day later in Israel, let's say, who accompanied the body to Israel and then returned back to finish Shiva in America, that they can join the count of those who began prior to. There's a concept of gadol habayit and kind of the head of the household determining. And I think even if there isn't a definitive head of the household, if one part of the family started and another part of the family joins them, there's ample room. And again, I think that's what halacha k'divrei hamekel ba'avel means. It means not objectively that we follow the lenient view. It means that we take into account the circumstances, the individual feelings and emotions that are involved, and mining the range of halachic sources on AVEILUT and what they say and what they convey about it, kind of tailoring it for the specific circumstance. On the other hand, if you have a circumstance where it's very meaningful for some members of the family to sit for that additional day. I remember, like, my father just was sitting Shiva for his brother, and he wanted to sit with his nephews in Teaneck, and then he also felt like he didn't want to make the Shiva in Teaneck be a parade of people from the 5 towns coming to see him, so he stayed in Teaneck, and then after Shabbos he did a Saturday night and a Sunday morning in Lawrence, and it was an extra day from what they were doing because he had gone to Israel. So he opted to do that to finish his personal Shiva, even though some of the other members of the family ended their Shiva earlier. So again, I think that all of those kinds of the flexibility, it has, and that's why it's not a rabbinic klali hapsak. It's specific to the laws of AVEILUT. This idea that the emotional element and the personal grief and the way in which you navigate that needs to be so personalized, individualized, that halacha k'divrei HaMekel ba'avel is not follow the lenient view. It's individualize it for the mourner so that it can be as impactful and meaningful and, yes, as lenient as necessary. But if the mourner is like Pinchas and wants to adopt a stringent view in a particular circumstance, because that is what they need in order to kind of fully inhabit the mourning period, and then Pinchas is right. Shmuel, the author of Halacha K'divrei HaMekel Ba'avel, doesn't totally get the meaning and the impact. Somebody had a question?
Is this kind of flexibility, halachic flexibility that's attuned to the personal needs, applied in any other situation?
Not really. That's what I'm arguing is what Halacha K'divrei HaMekel Ba'avel means. That's precisely what it means, that this is a realm of halacha and a realm of human experience which requires that built-in flexibility, and Halacha K'divrei HaMekel Ba'avel is the term which captures that. Shmuel may not have known that that's what it was supposed to mean when he invented it, but the Gemara, by kind of putting this story involving Shmuel immediately after the halachic ruling which introduces this principle, kind of makes that clear and suggests, and I have found that saying this to mourners and explaining it is very meaningful and empowering. I said it with I mentioned this last week. Like, one of the things that I had with Sherry when she was in her year of AVEILUT is like I would like tell her what the technical halacha is, and she would like get upset at me about, I don't want to go see movies. Like, okay, you told me I can go see a movie during Yibet Chodesh. I don't want to do that. This is the way I'm coping and dealing with it. And it, after 3 months of being a completely unhelpful husband and being a halachic authority instead, I started to realize, oh no, that's exactly what the Pinchas Shmuel discussion here is about. Don't be Shmuel who's telling your loved one,
let her do it her way.
Right, exactly. And again, as long as there still is importance to the halachic views that are expressed. It's not that we kind of, and we talked about this last week, the counterweight is you're not supposed to sit Shiva for 2 weeks. You're not supposed to say I'm doing Shloshim for 3 months, or I'm saying Kaddish for 6 years. The halacha is also sensitive to excessive mourning, and so I think the formulating his halacha k'divrei HaMekel Ba'avel is take the views that are expressed and kind of pinpoint or personalize or individualize them, make them attuned to kind of where you're at. So, because the goal ultimately is to mourn in a meaningful way, and then to be able to kind of integrate also in due course.
So this story a little bit negates what Ramban was saying, that a person really kind of wants to go the direction of Simcha.
So this is actually goes the other. I think, and that's why I think the Ramban can't fully wrap his head around what it could mean, what Halacha K'divrei HaMekel Ba'avel could mean as a principle which is unique to AVEILUT. He's still thinking about it in terms of that lenient and strict, and so he says, well, maybe it means that people don't grieve when they're in doubt about something. But what I think this principle really means, and what the story I think captures, is that Halacha K'divrei HaMekel Ba'avel expresses that when there's a range of views, you individualize it so as to meet the other where they need to be met. Questions, comments?
Is there any, God forgive me because I don't believe this, but is there any philosophical basis for people who believe that death is not so bad, and that they're going to Olam Haba, and they will be joined, so that precipitates a feeling of lenience? I mean, would that be any?
That's a very interesting issue in terms of applying it here. There is, we're going to come back to the Rambam, which we had on our sources for last week, but which we bracketed for today. The Rambam has a philosophical view, not necessarily connected with Olam Haba, which is kind of the soul is freed of its bodily shackles.
They're at peace.
Right. The Rambam wouldn't say it like that. He would say much more philosophically that a person who achieves a certain level of philosophical insight, that's really the ultimate goal of our lives here. And once we're then free of our physical bodies, we're able to kind of just operate on that other level. And so that's very important. We're going to see for the Rambam's view of mourning, of AVEILUT, and why he doesn't think that that we need to do certain mourning practices because the soul is mourning its own death. That's a concept that appears in the Gemara, which the Rambam completely rejects, and we're going to see how he reinterprets that Gemara. But your question is a really interesting one. Does that play a role in this context? I have not seen that. I haven't seen anybody connect those points, but that's worth thinking about. So let me just summarize, and again, you can take the sources with you because there's a lot more to unpack. We talked a little bit about the Ramban's question about why it is when it comes to mourning that we have lenient practices. The Ramban said it's either the general rules of halacha or it's something unique to AVEILUT, but he doesn't fully express it. Then we saw the Gemara where the principle first appears in the story that is placed immediately after that legal principle, and it sounds like we have a deeper understanding of what halacha k'divrei mekel ba'avel could mean as a unique principle specifically applicable to the laws of mourning, and that is that it's a way in which the individual can navigate the mourning process given the different halakhic views in a way that's most conducive to healthy grieving. There are a number of other circumstances in which we do apply this rule. For example, and this I want to take a couple minutes just to point out that it's complicated. Okay, one of the ways in which this rule was applied, and we might say misapplied, is by Rabbi Hain in the Shiltot, who says even though there's a lot of discussion in the Gemara about this, that if a person sits Shiva even for a moment before a holiday, that the holiday nullifies the Shiva. And again, here's where we get, okay, this is intended as a leniency because we don't want people to have to mourn. It's a difficult thing to do to continue to mourn, but there are circumstances, and we're probably all familiar with ones either from our own lives or from others, where someone lost a parent right before a holiday and sat Shiva for a few hours, and how that left them with, unresolved grief or not able to fully mourn. So again, this principle is applied by Rabbi Hain, one of the Gaonim, in that circumstance, and I think it's worth at least, again, I'm not saying that we paskin differently, but there are ways in which I think we should take the idea of halacha k'divrei mekel ba'avel and apply them. So I remember when J.J. Greenberg died, he died right before Yom Kippur, and it was a very challenging, crazy time, and there was a very brief Shiva, and it was in Israel because JJ was in Israel, but I remember when the Greenbergs came back here, I think after Sukkot, they received people for a couple of days, and I thought that was, particularly meaningful, and I think in the spirit of halacha k'divrei mekel ba'avel. There's nothing against, having a time designated and set aside for people to come and share memories of your loved one and the like. So I think, again, just to kind of come back to our central thesis for today, it's that the laws of AVEILUT are unique, and that applying those laws, I think there's no other area of halacha where we kind of tailor it as much to the individual as we do to when it comes to the laws of mourning. This may be a model which pushes us to think about other areas of halacha and how we apply halacha. I'll grant that. It could inform on that as well. But I think specifically in the area of halachic divrei hamekel ba'avel, it really pushes us to realize how each individual needs to mourn in a way that's particularly meaningful to them, and that the halachic framework gives a little bit of that flexibility and individualization that can make it particularly meaningful. There are some areas where we don't apply this principle. Kriya is one of them, where again that's partially because it's pre-AVEILUT. Some of the Rishonim say, oh, Kriya is not technically during the mourning period, it's before your mourning.
It declares them. Basically
Right,
declaration.
right. So again, there's a lot to unpack on where the line is drawn about what's within the rule of halachic divrei hamekel ba'avel and what's not, and what that says about those particular practices and their necessity and their lack of individualized application. But we're going to leave it here for now. Next week, I want to do two things. I want to return to the Rambam's view on AVEILUT because I think it's critically important, and I want to do half the time unpacking some insights from Kaddish, which I think we overlook. A lot of people, talk about Kaddish, think about Kaddish, make Kaddish a central part of their mourning, and I think there's more to it that we can share. Thanks for coming today, everybody. Have a good day. I got to go proctor an AP. I'm running.